Okay, we are back for another update on this Project Raider. This is episode 4, and what we accomplished this week was mostly engine work. We got the engine put back together, for the most part. A couple odds and ends I still have to put on, but for the most part the engine's done. We put the pistons in. You have a little update on how we made some progress on the pistons. The crank went in, and then we put together the front timing chain set. Timing chain and balance shaft chains and tensioners and all that. So I put the reconditioned crank in the block tonight, and when you tighten down these caps, you start with the center, put all the caps on, and then you start with the center and go 2, 4, front and back, and you do it in 3 stages up to 60 foot-pounds. And I have a plastic gauge strip that I'm going to check a couple of these journals, but it's been machined with new bearings, so the plastic gauge isn't really that necessary. So make sure that you match up the caps with the original rods. You can learn about all of this on, if you YouTube a engine building video, you have more in depth on how to rebuild an engine. But the rod caps are machined for each rod. They're honed out and surfaced and all that. If you mix them up accidentally, you can put them together and just look for the hone marks, the lines on either side here, and they'll match up. And you can, once you get one matched up, then you can match the next one, and it'll become easier with the fewer rod caps to match up. If you mix match them, it'll just bind, they won't work. It's required that you match your caps with your rods. In fact, on this build, I marked them, but I still didn't, I mixed them up a little bit. So you just put them together and match up the lines, the hone marks on the sides of these caps. Okay, I'm putting these pistons on, and I had them all in the motor, and the flywheel or the crank wasn't turning. It was one of the rods had grabbed the crank and it was too tight. So after spending some time trying to figure out what the problem was, it dawned on me that I had mixed up a couple of the caps. Now the caps on the top of your rods have to match. You have to, when you pull them apart, you have to keep them and put it back on the same rod because they're machined for that rod, for that space. So I had mixed up a couple, and the way I figured it out was there are machining marks on the sides of, both on the sides of the rods and on the inside circumference. And if you get a magnifying glass and look for the marks to match up, that's the easiest way to figure out which one's which. You just go one cap at a time and put them on. They all face in one direction. You'll have a bump on the one side of your cap that faces the engine forward, and you'll have the letters on your rod that are engine forward, so you know that part. And then you just have to match up the the markings. So once I got all the markings matched up, crank turns fine now that all the pistons are in. So as you can see here, I spent the last couple of hours putting the chains on the front of the engine. It's a big fat timing chain in the back, and the smaller chain runs the oil pump and the two balance shafts. You have a balance shaft here and one here. This is the oil pump. This chain runs off the crank, and to make sure everything is in time, you put the number one piston at the top, and you line up the chain for your cam at the top. Once those are lined up, you do the same with the balance shafts. You just line up the dark link with the button on each pulley. Each pulley has a button and a dark link. So once all those are matched up, then the engine will be in time. I also spent a couple of hours scrubbing down parts today, getting ready to put everything else back on the motor. Used a little bit of gasoline and some brake cleaner to get all the parts cleaned up. You can see here that we scrubbed down all the bright work, all the aluminum, the intake, the valve cover, the head, and the front timing chain cover all got scrubbed down. I like to use a gasoline to get rid of all the grease and dirt, and then spray it off with some brake cleaner that blasts it clean. And once you put that on a freshly painted motor, it actually turns out pretty good looking. I noticed the fuel pump that came with the engine was broken. It was cracked on the inside, and so I'll have to buy a new fuel pump as well as a new water pump. Now I'm waiting for one small bolt for one of the tensioner arms. The bolt that was included with this motor was the wrong one, and it was a bit sloppy. It wasn't as tight as it could be. So I ordered a new bolt. That'll come in a couple of days, and I'll put that on. But essentially, we're done with the motor for now. I'm going to set that aside, and we're going to start working on the engine bay, getting the engine bay completely cleaned out, and fixing some of the wiring, perhaps fixing the air conditioning. And then also cleaning up the suspension. The suspension was kind of caked with mud and some grease, and so I'm chiseling that off and cleaning it up and trying to find out if there's any damaged parts. I think I got a couple of rubber components here and there, a couple of tie rod ends maybe that are worn out. Started the process of cleaning up the front suspension. There was quite a bit of mud and some grease from the fittings caked on much of the front suspension, so I'm starting the process of chiseling it off, spraying it down, and cleaning it up and seeing if anything needs to be replaced. I think I found a couple of tie rod ends that are worn out, shocks may be worn out, and then some of the rubber grommets, like this sway bar, is pretty hashed out here, so I'll probably end up replacing some of these parts. Brakes look okay for now, probably 50%, but the rotors are fine. There's hardly any grooves in them at all, and the pads are about 50%, so I probably just wait on the brakes for a while. I found a parts car on Craigslist. You can see the ad here. $200 south of Seattle. I'm quite a bit north of Seattle. I'm up by Canada, close to Canada. And so I wrestled all day today whether I should go down and pick up this parts car. There's a handful of parts I need for this thing, and it would ultimately be cheaper to spend $200 and some gas money to go get this other car. But, you know, there's no title with it, and I don't want to be stuck with a carcass outside of the house for too long. And I don't cherish the idea of, you know, spending half a day driving through Seattle to pick up a junked out car. So I don't know. I'm not sure that we're going to pick that up. The things that I know that I need are a skid plate for the front of this. I need a radio, hopefully the stock one. I'm just kind of hoping to get a stock radio put back in it. And then a few other odds in it. Some trim pieces, the original oil pressure gauge. This has an aftermarket, and I like the look of the original stock gauge. So a few odds and ends I could have pulled off this other car. But it... I think we're going to pass on that and just buy bits and pieces off of eBay. Made a little bit of progress in the interior, took out the seats, fixing to take that center console out, and then we're going to tear these carpets out of here so I can get to the heater core, fix the heater core, new carpets go in, we'll scrub down the interior, and then I'm going to reupholster the seats and repaint that roll bar. So this interior will be looking pretty nice with not a whole lot of work. Here is the driver's seat that I'm going to be redoing with new material. I'll also be taking apart the seat track. This is the Safari off-road seat track, which has a shock absorber system in it. We'll take that apart and re-grease it and paint it up again. But when you're driving down the highway, you keep the lock on right here for just a regular seat. And then when you want to go off-road, you just unhook it, and the whole seat bounces on a shock absorber underneath the seat. And you can adjust the firmness of the shock absorber by this crank right here. Kind of a cool feature for these little off-road vehicles. So over the next week on the agenda will be scouring down the engine bay, cleaning that up and fixing some of the wiring, and then ultimately putting that engine back in probably later in the week. And then we'll turn our attention to the interior. I've already pulled the seats out, front seats sitting right here. We're gonna work on the seat frame, the Safari seat frame and the shock absorber system. I'll clean it up and repaint it, and then we're gonna tear the seats apart and sew together some new upholstery for them. So we have the engine bay, front suspension, clean all that up, put the engine in, rip out the interior, put in new carpet, new seat, upholstery, replace the heater core, and then we're gonna be getting real close to having this thing ready to fire up and put a set of tires on it. So check back and we'll make some more progress over the next week.